Well, hello, ICPR. I'm Mateo Sanchez from the University of Amsterdam, and I'm here with Nicolas Langlitz from the New School for Social Research in New York. And he's part of our little community thanks to this book he wrote some years ago, Neuropsychedelia, about the revival of hallucinogen research since the decade of the brain. And his newest book is Chimpanzee Culture Wars, Rethinking the Human Nature alongside Japanese, European, and American cultural primatologists. And we're here to discuss, actually to have an interview about the topic of politics and psychedelics. So let's get right into it. We have a whole list of questions, so let's see how many we get to do in our brief time.
Thank you for talking to me, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to go with the first question, just read it out because I think it will take us straight into what we want to discuss. So, individualism is today a central tenet of our self-understandings and an element of the technology of power relations in liberal democracies, which organize around the autonomous individual as the locus of merit and blame for the outcomes of our social relations. And therefore, these social relations are absolved of having any significant causal or structural role in determining those outcomes. Now, within this setup, what role might psychedelic drugs and research be said to occupy, both either as fitting into it and its assumptions or providing alternatives to this individualism?
You know, I think, first of all, I would contest this overall characterization of the current moment. I think, of course, individualism continues to play a significant role, but at the same time, we've also seen an upsurge of populisms and neo-nationalisms across the Western world. And those are forms of collectivist philosophies, which are very much opposed to neoliberalism. And to the kind of individualism that it embodies. I mean, so, you know, I think that's certainly something to consider, you know, if you're trying to think about the place of psychedelics in the current world and the way in which they relate to individualism. It's not the only game in town.
Right.
My sense is we should do more research on the social psychological consequences of using psychedelics. Of course, there is a little bit of research out on that, but it's not very consistent. There are probably sampling biases, especially with respect to the political effects of psychedelics. I'm thinking of Card Harris's study that suggests that psychedelics might make people more liberal and environmentally conscious. But then if you look at where the test subjects came from, you can assume that these were people who already were quite liberal and environmentally conscious. So, you know, what would happen if you would have a population of, you know, neo-nationalist voters? Would they come out of this the same way? Meaning, you know, moving more towards the progressive side. Or would you see an amplification of, you know, value judgments and socio-political orientations that they already brought to the table? Because that's basically how Stanley Groff thought of psychedelics, right? As these non-specific amplifiers of what's already there. And, you know, intuitively, I would go for the latter. And maybe not just intuitively, also because if you look at the ethnographic archive, you see that there is a pretty wide variety of uses. And, you know, individualism has certainly been an important element in psychedelic culture.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
you know,
Even
if you take Aldous Huxley, sorry.
Even if in its progressive forms, right, with lyric.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah. Huxley was also a strong individualist. I mean, a lot of the people who shaped the field were very much committed to liberalism.
Mm.
And if you look at the present, there are so many libertarians around,
Yeah.
at least in American psychedelia.
Yeah.
So you know, there is that, but on the other hand, you know, ethnographically, you have, for example, the Huichol peyote hunt, which is a collective ritual to become fully Huichol, right? It's a rite of passage. So this is about shaping your ethnic identity, and it makes you part of a collective.
Yeah.
You know, that's also possible, of course. So I you know, my intuition is that you know, psychedelics can be used to catalyze certain things that are around in people or in collectives anyway.
Yeah.
But they don't have a specific political effect.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. That's also the approach I would take. I think also, I mean, already when you get, my concern more broadly is kind of about individualism is precisely, you know, coming from an approach that's left of liberal, right? So it's kind of seeing, first of all, for example, in the case of new nationalisms, how often in policy they coincide with the kind of economic policy that actually, right, has this kind of individualistic setup, and therefore, you know, keeps kind of blaming certain groups of people for the outcomes that they have. And then as well, you can be liberal and be ecological, but also have doubts about how to approach the issue and which groups are going to be most or least affected by it. So that's kind of the question. What would, you know, some right? So if drugs, if the psychedelic drugs just amplify and are kind of non-specific, what kind of drug cultures, right? You say in one of your essays, like, to shift from the emphasis on the drugs to the drug cultures. What other forms of kind of progressive drug cultures are out there, or have been out there? Maybe, you know, what's the difference between, say, the drug culture in the 60s counterculture and that form of individualism from current neuroscientific individualism or so on?
I mean, the neuroscientific individualism is purely heuristic, right? The point is that what you can study in the neurosciences are individuals, at least for the most part. I mean, there are very few research paradigms where you try to look at how people's brains respond to each other by recording multiple EEGs or putting two people at the same time in scanners and have them interact or something like that. But for the most part, you go for individuals, right? You don't get to see what happens in a group of people. And I don't think, you know, this is an epistemological form of individualism. It has it you know, might have political consequences if you use it to naturalize political orientations and decision making and so on. You basically ignore that there is a social context to it that ultimately informs these decisions, and that even when these people are in the scanner, they are still part of a collective that, you know, they somehow relate to and that matters to them.
Yeah.
But you know, other than that this naturalization might give people the wrong ideas, I don't think that there is any deeper political intention behind it.
Right. I mean, I guess the question would be, you know, what would you see as some of the potential results of the internalization, like social internalization of neuroscientific knowledge? Because it's really a kind of a dominant approach in the psychedelics field, but also, for example, in biological psychiatry and so on. And that view, that naturalization, as you say, of the kind of purely epistemological point of view, has consequences in terms of, for example, what research agendas for the treatment of mental health issues has, or so on. So how
I
can
mean,
how
that
those
is,
assumptions translate into political effects?
I mean, that is the, very long-standing social scientific critique of the neurosciences, that they are biologizing and thereby individualizing social problems, right? That
Mm-hmm.
The real causes are really in the social situation. Why do we see more and more depression? Why do we see a growing number of addiction, and all of that? And that responding to that purely on the basis of neuropharmacological interventions, for example, would be a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if take the opioid epidemic in the US at the moment, it very clearly has to do with social policies and with an economic devastation of the areas that are most severely affected by the opioid epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
And you may or may not be able to help people with pharmacological interventions, but if you want to get to the root of that, you would have to change something about their living conditions as well. I think Bruce Alexander's Red Park experiment from the 70s, opened up a really interesting pathway for psychopharmacology, which was hardly taken up, for the most part. I mean, what Alexander did was he put these these rats into and built a beautiful park for them, where they could exercise and meet other rats and have like a very enriched experience in their captivity. And then he compared them to rats that were isolated in the usual sensory deprived boxes that laboratory rats usually live in. And these two study groups both had access to addictive drugs, and it turned out that the addictive potential of these drugs was much lower in the case of the rich environment. So what previously had appeared like a quality of these drugs now turned out to be something that, of course, had to do with the drugs. I mean, you don't get addicted without an addictive substance, but it also had a lot to do with the environment. So suddenly you get a much more complex picture, right? You get an organism, in this case a rat, and a particular kind of drug and a particular kind of environment. And it is between the three of them that something like addiction arises. And so, I mean, I think, obviously it would be good to develop a more complex understanding of drugs in the sense of an ecopharmacology that also takes into consideration environmental factors, or, to introduce experimental paradigms from social psychology into psychopharmacology. All these things I think would help to correct the
as drugs, right, that seem to amplify environmental factors. Do you feel that psychedelics kind of there's a limit on how well equipped, cognitive neuroscience or other epistemologies that have this, heuristic individualism. There's a limit to how well they can understand psychedelics and whether psychedelics can help transform kind of the emphasis and the type of methodology that we should apply in virtue of this kind of environmental factor amplification.
You mean in psychopharmacology more generally?
No, I mean in terms of like psychedelics, because of because they amplify environmental factors. Do you see that as basically at odds to a certain extent with this kind of psychopharmacological focus or reduction, and whether they'll be able to kind of move the emphasis towards other fields that have this more social, broader analysis of, say, addiction or whatever?
I mean, first of all, I think psychopharmacologists should try to make more of a case for that. I think a lot of people, including some of the psychopharmacologists I used to work with, believe that psychedelics I don't know, maybe amplify the effects of environmental factors. But that is a very interesting pharmacological claim in its own right. And I think we would need to see more evidence for that. And then we would want to understand better what the mechanism for that is, right? Why would certain drugs open you up to the environment and others do not? And actually, there are also indications that in some ways psychedelics do the opposite, that they kind of get you to process things more internally and to create all kinds of interconnections between things that were already going on in your brain, mind-brain. So, I think this is a very interesting question, and I haven't seen a lot of interesting, good research on it so far. My sense is that I mean, the observation that the setting in which a psychedelic is taken affects the experience that people have with it goes back all the way to the late 19th century, to the first anthropologists who observed Native American groups using peyote ritual contexts, and some of these people also knew the experimental psychological work that was going on at the same time in laboratories, and in the labs people experienced peyote very differently than the Native Americans did in their ceremonies. So it's a long-standing insight, which Timothy Leary later on came to refer to as set and setting, maybe psychedelics, if it's true that they create more of a connection with the environment, and that the experiences they catalyze are more contingent on the environment than, say, cocaine or an SSRI or Ritalin or whatever, then they might require a different paradigm. But maybe, they just highlight a quality that all psychoactive drugs have.
Sure.
And I think there would also be evidence for that, to make that case. And in that case, we should think about how to get at that and what kind of research paradigms we would need to learn more about that.
Yeah.
Maybe, psychopharmacology should not just be a laboratory science, but it should also become a field science, where you work more actively with uncontrolled environments. And speaking of, you mentioned my new book, Chimpanzee Culture Wars. Some of that work is with field primatologists, and I occasionally thought about their methods in relation to what I had seen in the psychedelic labs, because I mean, my kind of field work is primarily qualitative. I'm interested in philosophical questions, and I try to work them through with scientists. But the behavioral researchers following the chimpanzees, they work in an uncontrolled environment, and they think very hard about how to collect the data so that they can establish their truth claims on the basis of quantification. And it's of course, I mean, there are significant tensions in that field between laboratory and field researchers. But those tensions in principle can be resolved if both parties acknowledge the limitations of their approaches. And in primatology, it's completely normal that there are some people working with captive apes in laboratories, and there are certain things you can better establish in these contexts, and some people work with them in under field conditions. And there's a lot of interesting behavior that you can only see in the field, and that informs laboratory experiments, and so there is an ongoing exchange. Why shouldn't that be possible for psychopharmacology? Why should there not be a field psychopharmacology that is in a conversation with the lab guys?
What would be like some of the kind of tracing the kind of emergence of neuroscience and kind of establishment in the final decade of the brain and so on? What are some of the kind of histories or reasons, some of which we might be able to call political, through which neuroscience and this kind of pharmacological approach to drugs in general and psychedelics more specifically took shape? Like in one of your essays, you mentioned, right, the kind of the drug war, or the shift of psychiatry into scientific medicine and so on. Could you talk about that? About
you mean why the emphasis on drug action rather and
yeah, why the lack of this kind of contextual approach that you're talking about?
I don't think that it's driven by politics primarily, other than in the case of the war on drugs. In the case of the war on drugs, the argument was that the drugs are the problem, so the people who bring the drugs into the country are the problem. And that's what we have to work on. Right. If you would go for the rat park experiment, you would realize that, I mean, first of all, the addictive potential of the drugs alone is not as significant as it was presented on the basis of these animal studies of, highly sensory deprived animals. Yeah. And then you would draw attention to the fact that people often live under conditions that apparently are a little more like living in a small plexiglass box rather than in a rat park, in a rich environment. And what you would have to do is enrich the environment, and since that costs money, you would need to mobilize public resources, which especially in the US is not a very popular thing. Among the constituencies that usually determine elections here, then it's not popular to provide a more complex picture of what's happening. Right. And of course, there is a lot of evidence that this is how drugs work. They're people who live under in good conditions use a lot of drugs recreationally, and they don't have significant issues with them. Of course, some of them do. I mean, it's not like drugs are not part of the problem, but they're not the whole story. So, there I think there is a political motivation to blame the drugs alone rather than pay attention to the environment. But other than that, I think, a lot of it is just methodologically driven.
Right.
You basically, the tools you have allow you to study individuals. They allow you to do randomized placebo-controlled trials. Getting at the complexity of environmental factors makes the research design a lot more messy. Or you would need like an enormous amount of control conditions that you basically repeat the study with the same way, but now the research staff treats the subject differently.
Yeah.
You would do it in a different research space. You would do it with, I don't know, if you take these clinical studies, they usually include some music. So you would change the music and so on, right? And the problem with that, I think, is that if you look at the a number of subjects that are usually studied in these psychedelic studies, they're very small, right? It's not unusual that you have 10 to 20, sometimes less than 10 subjects in a study. I mean, the basic research. Now that the clinical stuff is looking a little different, but there is not a whole lot of money for it.
Yeah.
So every subject you recruit costs a significant amount. So, how would you, I mean, you would need hundreds of subjects to satisfy all the control conditions. And, so I think there are just very practical limits for why people stick to this. And then you also have to see this, neuroscience is a hyper-competitive field, and it's very fast moving, and you have to mill out a lot of papers in high-impact journals. And there are rules of the game, and all these, more social, psychological, not to speak of field methodologies, are not well recognized in that field. To the extent that they exist, they're super marginal. And these are not the approaches with which you get into the high impact journals. So, and the psychedelic researchers, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, but I would say that is probably still the case, have to prove that they are not, crazies like Timothy Leary, who will, basically go down the deep end yet again. So they are the ones who in a way have to play by the book even more than people in other parts of the neurosciences and in psychopharmacology. So, I think they have good reasons to be very conservative about what they do.
Sure. Yeah. So there's kind of structural barriers to moving research in that direction.
Yeah.
I think also like what I mean when I ask about, the politics of the history of the rise of neuroscience or of the, illegalization of psychedelics and their rise. I mean, more in terms of, not the fact that there are kind of particular political actors that make politically kind of intentioned decisions, but rather how it all works together in terms of, for example, the drug war, trying to focus on a narrow version of what addiction is, and how that like rests on the emergence of the neuroscientific paradigm as the dominant methodology. Of course, there's questions of pharmaceutical companies. There's the shift in psychiatry from a more kind of Freudian base to biological psychiatry, and how all these things.
I mean, since you're mentioning the pharmaceutical companies, they of course also play a significant role because they are selling drugs, right?
Yeah.
And so they're not selling a drug that works under particular settings with people who arrive with a particular kind of mindset, and then maybe it will help. But they want to make the case that here is a drug, you take it, you will be better.
Yeah.
And that case you make with a randomized placebo-controlled trial that shows a strong effect on the basis of, you know, that can be attributed entirely to the drug.
Yeah.
So so what you do is you try to standardize all the other factors, and of course you try to design them in a way that they will be conducive to this without it becoming visible that they actually help the drug along, right?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, this has been one of my you know, epistemological criticisms of the way in which the clinical studies for psychedelics were run in the past decade, that, you know, they have been mobilizing a lot of things, including music, including psychotherapies, all of which presumably play a very significant role in the effect of that ultimately becomes visible. But the research design itself is entirely focusing on the drug.
Yeah.
You know, people are not saying, okay, let's control for the psychotherapy. Let's, you know, treat one person with cognitive behavioral, another person with psychoanalysis, another person with, you know, a third kind of psychotherapy. And then let's see what the MDMA or the psilocybin is doing. Or,
Sure.
you know, let's play death metal to them instead of Arvo Pärt. Are they still, you know, getting mystical type experiences? I mean, all of that could be tested. And, you know, I totally understand why people are not doing it, because, you know, that's not the game that the FDA or EMA are playing. And so, you know, I'm not like, you know, seriously up in arms about it. But I do think that we have to recognize that, you know, there is an important aspect or dimension here that's basically just being ignored. And I would really hope that once approval for these substances is given and research becomes easier, people will start to look into that part of the story, and then, you know, also start experimenting more with, you know, different kinds of psychotherapies and so on.
Yeah. Talking about, you know, when I mean, MDMA seems to be fairly close to becoming available for psychotherapy, right? For PTSD, I think, in the US. I suppose when that happens, it'll have to be moved from the Schedule 1. What is it, Schedule 1 or Class A? I get them mixed up. Schedule 1.
Schedule 1.
Which will, what, like, I mean, of course, the offense will be much smaller if they get caught with it. Do you think that will promote a larger use of MDMA amongst people, as it's seen, like, not only that the risks are smaller in terms of, you know, prison or fines or whatever, but also that it's kind of legitimized as something that's not as dangerous as we thought? And what kind of, you know, drug cultures or forms of life might it spawn or help to promote and so on?
You know, I think the rescheduling as such is not as significant. Cocaine is not a Schedule 1 drug. It still has medical use in eye surgery. And if you get caught with cocaine, that doesn't help you at all, right? So rescheduling doesn't mean legalization in any way.
Yeah, definitely.
But of course, the way to rescheduling, which is, you know, showing clinical efficacy and showing that there are, you know, beneficial uses in pharmacopsychotherapy, I think that is already changing the image of these drugs quite significantly. I mean, I think, you know, the image change is well underway. Yeah. If you follow the news media reporting about psychedelics in Well, basically, ever since I got into this in the mid 2000s, it has just been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, even if you see Steve Ross talking on CNN,
Yeah,
you know, they ask him like one pro forma, you know, pseudo critical question, so he can object to that, and they can say that they, you know, haven't given him carte blanche, and that's it. And you know, the story that they give a platform to is basically psilocybin helps you know, terminal cancer patients to die more peacefully, and so on. So you know, I don't know what kind of drug culture is that going to give rise to. I mean, I'm pretty sure that what we are already seeing is that the success of these mainstreaming strategies brings in very different constituencies.
Yeah.
And so, you know, does that mean that we will ultimately see psychedelic psychotherapy of terminal patients in some, you know, Midwestern hospital with a primarily evangelical patient body who will then undergo these experiences and discuss them with their evangelical pastor? I don't know. I mean, given that, you know, this country is becoming more.
It'll depend a lot. I mean, MDMA is a specific, you know, I guess even if you term it within psychedelics, which some people don't, but it has very specific effects as well in terms of empathy and kind of social feelings.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking more about the psilocybin stuff, but yeah, of course. I mean,
slightly different. I mean, whoever you talk to, if you talk to a pastor or you talk to a therapist or a neuroscientist, I mean, if you go with the experience of having had these kind of strangely amplified social empathy feelings, I guess discussions are bound to lead in a certain direction.
Yeah. And you know, but the veterans who, you know, they are already playing a role in this. If you think about how, what's this guy's name, Sergeant Lubecki or something, got Breitbart on board, and got Rebecca Mercer to give $1 million to MAPS. You know, I mean, this is an entirely different group of people. You know, who, you know, I mean, Lubecki was on the Rand Paul campaign, so he was associated with libertarian politics already, and then, you know, you could think of Steve Bannon and the Breitbart folks as being like a rightist counterculture who, you know, enjoy in their own way to, you know, épater la bourgeoisie, to shock the bourgeois establishment, but you know, these are new groups of people who are entering into the picture now, and I think we'll see more of that.
Yeah, why I think the you know, discussion about methodologies and the assumptions behind methodologies is important, because, you know, as psychedelics become, you know, used for therapy, even amongst different constituents of people, whatever methodology or you know, perspective is offered to those who either undergo therapy or get informed about it in you know, in media and so on, will eventually affect the direction in which that goes, I would assume. But it's different to popularize. It might have different social effects to popularize psychedelics through a neuroscientific paradigm, which has this heuristic individualism, as we've discussed, or even a purely kind of pharmacological one, than it is to popularize them around the discourse, kind of psychotherapeutical discourse of, you know, acceptance and commitment theory. So in that sense, I think that's why it's an important kind of, well, you want to say political battlefield or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine that the clinical stuff will be more important in the popularization. I mean, nobody was, you know, the basic neuroscience work, never got a lot of popular attention. I mean, sure, there were very few articles that said, oh, they're experimenting with, but then it actually wasn't LSD. And if they said they're experimenting with psilocybin, then no newspaper reader knew what that was. And they'd say, oh, the magic mushrooms, and people were like, okay. But, it just wasn't of much interest. I think the significant public interest came with the clinical studies. This was a very good intuition on Rick Doblin's part when he I mean, at the end of the day, he didn't invest as much into the terminal cancer patients and the dying process, but for a while he considered that, and his reasoning was that we all die, we are all afraid of it, and it's something that people across the political spectrum share. So you can get lots of people on board. So, okay, turned out that the PTSD thing worked out better for him. And, obviously there are, again, political reasons to build a broad coalition that, now brings in people from the right as well. And, and I think that's a good thing. I think he had good intuitions in that respect. But this is the kind of stuff that your average newspaper reader also cares about. And then, of course, I mean, Michael Pollan was, I think it's a stroke of genius, to basically say these are not drugs for young people, these are drugs for middle-aged people who feel kind of stuck and feel, their life is getting sclerotic, and they have to make a change and kind of mentally rejuvenate, is perfect, because this is exactly the kind of reader who is in positions, these are the decision makers, right? It doesn't help you to get a lot of college students turned on.
No,
but if you get your New York Times journalist who's been sitting there for 20 years, writing these articles and feeling kind of, tired and worn out. And if you get that person excited, then, you reach a whole new platform.
I mean, it's probably, I think politically, in terms of, if you understand politically as legitimizing psychedelic research and drugs, it's been very great. It's a different question whether it's also politically kind of effective at the moment of trying to influence political or social life in a particular direction. But just maybe to end with a last question, based on the abstract that you have for your talk at ICPR, which I'll hopefully catch. You mentioned kind of this kind of almost paradox between the mystical unitive experience that seems to rely on a kind of transcending of the self, and then different discourses that try to kind of, you mentioned like gender theories that try to emancipate a particular identity. I was wondering also perhaps like this, would there be any value in the mystical experience for the nationalist identities that we've discussed at the beginning of the talk, in terms of, well, if psychedelics not only amplify but give this transcending of self, could they break identities and allow for the formation of new ones?
I think they can, I think they can definitely break identities and allow for the formation of new ones. The question, of course, is if, and I think that's the very point of a rite of passage, for example, right? If you're a Huichol and you take peyote to become, fully Huichol, then that's the point. And if you were raised in under the conditions of the Protestant ethic in the US, and then you take LSD and you come out as a member of the counterculture and you join your commune to live a very different life, then you've also acquired a new identity. And actually in both cases, a new collective identity, right? You make new connections and you break off other connections. I guess, my sense is more that the notion of the psychedelic has been very much associated with the state of ego dissolution, with mystical type experiences as experiences of ego dissolution. And this has been valued. There is a normative claim going along with that these that dissolving your ego is a good thing, and that it's a good thing for it actually not to come back together as robustly and as well bounded as it used to be. And sort of projects that aim at that value the formation of a certain kind of identity, emancipatory projects that promote an identity, that assert an identity, are at odds with that. And I don't want to dismiss these emancipatory projects. All I'm saying is that there is a paradox there. If we assume that psychedelic equals a unitive experience, and all these identity projects create social tensions.
Yeah.
If you assert one kind of an identity, you basically set it up in opposition to other kinds of identity. I think you can be as liberal as you like, but if you do this to form and assert a liberal identity, you do it in opposition to illiberal identities. So and I think that to me is the interesting paradox in there, and I think it's a real problem for how to think about the place of psychedelics in the current situation, where in a way you see a lot more social polarization and a lot more identity politics going on and so on. And the psychedelic discourse has tapped into that, and I personally feel uneasy about it, but I can also understand the political reasons for which people are pursuing these projects.
Sure. Well, I don't know how long we've been going for already. Probably like 45 minutes.
Yeah, it was a good conversation.
Well, I think maybe we should leave it here.
Yeah, to be continued some other time.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you.
Nice talk. And yeah, I will see your lecture at ICPR probably. And I saw you're moderating at some
philosophy panel. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm going to check that one out as well. So anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank you.